Hi there to our A-level history students. This video, as you can see, is about Native Americans and the New Deal period, which is essentially the 1930s. This video is going to help you with section A in your evaluation question, as the New Deal period is one of those periods of time that can be asked about in section A. It could also be used for section B and the thematic question, although remember, those questions will always be about the entire time period and not just one individual period like the New Deal. Let's start our video by just going back a stage and thinking about Native Americans in the 1920s. Now, there are some developments that on the surface seem quite positive for Native Americans in this decade. But we should say this: any sympathy shown to Native Americans was largely as a result of others acting on their behalf. And we should also say this: assimilation was still the aim of federal government policy. That hasn't changed. We're going to think about four things: the impact of the Dawes Act, the impact of World War I, the impact of the Indian Citizenship Act, and the impact of the Merriam Report. And within that, I'll talk about the impact of the American Indian Defense Association. Let's start with the impact of the Dawes Act then. As we know, by the 1920s, the Dawes Act has really started to embed allotment policy linked to its citizenship to the Native American community. The Dawes Act has resulted firstly in huge losses of land for Native Americans. It's introduced the concept of private ownership rather than communal or collective ownership. And most significantly, it meant that by the 1920s, approximately 2/3 of the Native American population had US citizenship. Remember though, unlike other groups like African Americans who were demanding citizenship and equality, Native Americans did not want citizenship. They did not want to live according to the US Constitution. That said, by this point, 2/3 are now citizens. A small proportion of those are Native American women who've married American men, but the vast majority have got that because after 25 years of farming their allotment, they become citizens. Also relevant to the 1920s, although slightly beforehand, is the impact of World War I on the Native American community. Approximately 10,000 Native American men fought in World War I, fighting with distinction. These soldiers were integrated rather than segregated units, and so there was a great deal of interaction between Native American and American men. They were recognised for their bravery and their contribution to World War I, but it wasn't just soldiers that Native Americans provided. Families were also sponsored to move from reservations to the cities to aid war industries. This is one of the first times that Native Americans moved to some of the larger cities, and this does aid assimilation for some. Remember, if they've been on a reservation, they're going to be very rural, very remote, and much of their culture can still be maintained. Most significantly, in the 1920s, the Indian Citizenship Act is introduced. This is done in 1924. It's important to note that this is not a reward for Native Americans' role in World War I, even though the timing of it does suggest it might be. It's also not a result of Native American campaigns for citizenship. As we said before, they did not want this. Therefore, we should view the Indian Citizenship Act as something that was conferred on Native Americans, whether they wanted it or not. Therefore, its aim was not to empower them by giving them citizenship, but to assimilate them, making them more like the mainstream American community. This move towards the Indian Citizenship Act came largely from states in the west of America, where reservations were mostly located. Those same states often resisted the extension of the franchise to Native Americans, and many put in stipulations or criteria that were forms of discrimination to prevent Native Americans from voting. In fact, we know this to be the case even as late as 1948, 24 years later, in the court case Harrison versus Levine, where two Native American men take the state of Arizona to court for an infringement of their right to vote. Lastly, the Merriam Report is produced in 1928. Prior to that, liberal white Americans had started to try and support Native American rights. The most significant of these is set up in 1923 and is called the American Indian Defense Association, or AIDA. And they are successful in blocking the Bursum and Leavitt bills. In 1928, though, the Brookings Institute for Government Research produces the Merriam Report, written by Lewis Merriam, a federal government employee. The Merriam Report is damning of allotment policy. It criticises it and condemns it. In fact, it concludes that it has deprived Native Americans of their land and left them economically insecure. It also went as far as to criticise the conditions on reservations. Here is the key though, it does not argue against assimilation. Once again, it argues against the methods that have been employed. By depriving Native Americans of land, by providing poor conditions, by leaving them economically insecure, they are unable to assimilate properly. The report concludes that Native Americans are the most impoverished people in the United States of America. President Hoover, the president at the time, reads the report and appoints a new Indian commissioner, a man called Charles Rhodes, and he introduces several reforms in order to improve life on reservations particularly. This leads us nicely into the 1930s, and we need to give some context to the New Deal period at this point. The 1920s were a time of economic boom for America, but by mid-1929, it was clear that their economy was starting to falter. Production levels, employment levels, and other measures of output were all down. On the 29th of October, prices on the stock market plunge to the point where 16.4 million shares are sold, and the value of the stock market drops by 37% in one day. Black Tuesday, as this comes to be known, or the Wall Street crash, triggers what we know as the Great Depression, and by March 1933, the value of the stock market was only 1/5 or 20% of what it originally was. In human terms, this is tragic. Between 29 and 32, personal income drops by over 50%. It leaves 13 million people unemployed, and so there's homelessness and pennilessness. Suicides rise, soup kitchens become overrun, families break up through the economic financial pressure placed on them. This affects those in the cities, but those in rural areas as well, as 1 million farms have to be returned to mortgage lenders in the early 1930s. Finally, hundreds of factories and mines shut, and Hoovervilles emerge, shanty towns built in parks and public spaces out of corrugated iron and steel and cardboard, named after the president at the time, President Hoover. President Hoover is quickly voted out of office, and a new president, Franklin Roosevelt, is elected in a landslide victory in 1932, taking office in 1933. He had three main aims to end the suffering caused by the Great Depression. Firstly, he wanted to remedy the financial crisis, particularly by helping the unemployed. He wanted to promote industrial recovery, and he wanted to raise commodity, which we mean crops and herds, and their prices. To do this, therefore, in his first 100 days, he and his Congress enact 15 proposals. These proposals that become laws are the start of the first New Deal period, roughly from March to June 1933. This is a New Deal for Americans to overcome the issues caused by the Great Depression. As you'll see, a second New Deal is embarked upon in 1935, and this legislation tries to cover things like banking, power supplies, the economy, farming, industry, and homeowners. Within these New Deal initiatives for Americans, this man, John Collier, is appointed to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. John Collier has come up before because he is one of the founding members of AIDA, the American Indian Defense Association. As the head of the BIA, John Collier lobbies strenuously with the head of New Deal departments to ensure Indians gain access to relief programs. So, for example, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which provided work for unmarried young men, creates an Indian division so that they benefit from this. Other projects to improve life on reservations through the employment of Indians are also pursued. And an earlier BIA decision to ban Indians from following their own religions is reversed. However, the most significant piece of legislation, and Collier's most radical idea, is to reverse the Dawes Act and end allotment policy, which has been in place since 1887. This is done through the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934, which is also known as the Indian Reorganization Act. We now want to focus on the Wheeler-Howard Act, and our key point is this. This is a significant turning point, but it lacks a long-term impact. The aims of the policy were to recognise and preserve the traditional culture of Indian tribes, which had long been neglected. The context is that the Act was substantially modified, though, from Collier's proposal. The 50-page proposal was watered down to only 6 pages, ultimately. Collier was also overambitious because he wanted to return the rights of self-government to tribes, and this was almost too ambitious for the time, and so again was rejected. Therefore, assimilation is still the aim, but again the methodology changes. And the logic from the Merriam Report is this: if Native Americans see the benefits of assimilation, and by that we mean the economic benefits, then they'll be more willing to assimilate. So therefore, education and economic sufficiency became the focus, which in part would then improve health and well-being for Native Americans. This last point is key though. Once again, the support of Native Americans is never secured. They are not consulted, and many have already been assimilated or aspired to be by this point. Once again though, Native Americans are not listened to. For this next slide, I'm going to organise some of the key points of the Indian Reorganisation Act into our main themes. These are political, legal, economic, land and social cultural. Firstly, the Wheeler-Howard Act or Indian Reorganisation Act involved increasing the Native American presence and involvement in the BIA. They were employed by the organisation and were consulted far more. The Act also extended political rights to Native American women far more than it did before. And crucially, as we said, allotment policy was ended. In terms of economic and land rights, well, the Act curtailed the sale of lands to individual buyers. And any land that was unallotted between 1900 and 1930 was restored. Native Americans were also encouraged to aspire for higher education. Now I have put this in this middle column that could come in socio-cultural possibly as well, but I'm thinking about the economic benefits of higher education there. Hospitals, schools and irrigation systems were also built on reservations. As mentioned already, a ban on ceremonial dances had been overturned that had lasted since 1883. And Collier's work stimulated an interest in Indian arts and crafts, again with a view to the Native Americans seeing an economic benefit to assimilation. They were allowed to practice their own religion, and that included using the hallucinogenic drug peyote, and children could now attend local schools. Tribal councils were re-established. So what's the impact of this New Deal period on Native Americans? Well, our key point remains the same, but let's draw some arguments for and against the significance of the Wheeler-Howard Act and this period as a whole. Firstly, the dramatic loss of land Native Americans suffered was curtailed. And federal funds were made available and did support the economic development of Native American communities. Thirdly, education and health provision therefore improved significantly. This is evidenced by the fact that by 1938, the Native American population was increasing faster than at the national rate. Tribes were also led by tribal councils again, as the Native Americans often desired. And then lastly, the input of Native Americans into the Bureau of Indian Affairs gave them some input on Indian policy, certainly more so than it had ever been given before. What about the arguments against? Well, the poverty of the Native Americans was so great that all of these measures did little to actually relieve their situation. It wasn't a significant enough response to solve the problem. Interestingly as well, 7 out of 245 tribes actually rejected the measures to be organised into self-governing bodies. And that links to our point about the Native Americans not being consulted and many not supporting the Wheeler-Howard Act. A secret ballot was also used to see if the Act would be acceptable to Native Americans. Native Americans did not appreciate this. Native Americans would make decisions typically in a tribal council where everybody was out in the open and views were expressed freely. A secret ballot seemed really like Western democracy, particularly the secretive part, and tribes therefore saw it as very suspicious. There was also an idea for a separate federal court for Native American affairs, but that was completely abandoned. And, crucially, although the loss of land was curtailed, no former reservation lands were bought back because there was insufficient funding. Lastly, and most crucially, and this links to our key point, the improvements were not long-lasting. World War II interrupts these funding streams to Native American reservations, and after World War II, termination policy is introduced, which, if you remember, sought to eliminate tribes and to eliminate reservations completely. That brings us to the end of this video. Here's 10 short questions that you might want to use to see if you have remembered everything we've covered.